Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Wednesday, July 8th, 2025, and today we have an awesome interview for you all with Dr. Patrick Fries of the Ward Laboratories, which is where we have been getting soil tests for the last few years. And Dr. Fries, which, yes, rules is a name, and which I'm sure he would also admit, discusses what this test is, how to take it, and what soil amending looks like when biology is the focal point. So let's do it. Dr. Patrick Fries, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jesse. It's great to be here.
And it's great to have you. I'm super excited about this conversation. I've actually been using the Haney test for a few years, and I'm excited to dig in a little bit on it. So tell us maybe first a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Patrick Fries, Dr. Patrick Fries. I am the Western Region Outreach Scientist and Research Lead at Ward Laboratories, which is based out of Kearney, Nebraska. I'm located in Reno, Nevada, so I focus on the Western U.S. I was formerly their Director of Research and Development for about 3 years, but then I wanted to move out west again, and so they coordinated with me to come out here and work more with specialty crops and markets and soil health and soil science education. A lot of what I was doing before, even research and development, but mostly focused on the Western U.S. So that's what I'm doing out here. I did my PhD in Washington State University, focusing on soil chemistry, environmental quality mostly, so heavy metals in orchard soils, and then cadmium contamination and rice paddies in Thailand for a year. So I lived in Thailand for a year working on that research. And so a lot of it was soil health, heavy metal chemistry, remediation, community impacts, things like that. So I had, human and science aspects to it, some toxicology, so it was pretty interesting. So now I'm back at Ward doing a lot of that still, surprisingly. People still have contamination issues in relation to agriculture, so that has never gone away. But still doing a lot of outreach, research, collaborations, method development with growers, education. It's pretty immersive.
Can we digress for a second and talk a little bit about what's causing, like, when you were talking about the contaminations in the orchard, like, what is that? What are those primary causes of those?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, and a lot of things that people don't really understand or weren't even aware of, especially people who buy houses in old orchard soils and they find all this contamination. So from about 1900 to 1950 or 60, they used what's called lead arsenate pesticides to treat codling moths in orchards. And this was a huge issue, still is for orchards. I still get this question, how to manage codling moths in orchards, and a lot of it they use now are like physical ways to manage it, but that's a totally different story. So they spread lead arsenic pesticides every year, tons and tons of this stuff every year in every orchard. So this isn't just a Washington State issue, it's everywhere where we had orchards globally, they use this. And the soil is like a sponge, it just soaked up the lead and the arsenic. And so it just built up year after year. And then, orchard soils are, I would say, prime real estate because they're well drained, they're near water supplies. So they're very scenic areas. So they sold the land for development. And especially in central Washington, this was a massive issue because people found thousands of ppms of lead and arsenic in their front lawn and backyard. Had no idea what they were getting into because you don't think to test the soil like that if you're buying a house. You just assume these things will be disclosed, but, for whatever reason they're not. I guess if you want to sell a house, you don't give them all the information. So around schools and hospitals, they're required to replace the soil, but around residential areas, they're not required to. And there's not really a paper trail to, hold someone accountable for this, years of contamination. So, people still want to garden, they still have kids who want to play in the dirt. And so we found ways of retaining the lead and the arsenic in the soil, keeping plants from taking it up using organic amendments that are chemically modified, either enriched with iron, or in some cases, like with the cadmium in Thailand and the rice paddies, we used biochar enriched with silica at some of the research. So you have to know a lot about the chemistry, how these things work in these systems. For example, if you apply compost directly to soil with lead and arsenic, it's great for binding up lead. It sticks to lead pretty readily, so the plants can't take it up. But it can release arsenic because of the different chemistries, or I would say similar chemistries. They repel each other, and so they kind of release the arsenic out into the soil for plant uptake. So you have to add iron as like the binding or the bridge that will grab onto the arsenic, while the compost, the organic part, grabs onto the lead. So it's pretty gritty chemistry, but it's a very practical way to reduce plant uptake and human exposure risks with lead and arsenic and cadmium in some cases.
Wow, that is fascinating. I definitely feel like there's so much more conversation to be had about, especially when you were talking about the biochar stuff. I know there's probably going to be a lot of interest in that, and maybe that's a conversation we can have another day if you're up for it.
Oh, for sure.
I wanted, though, for our particular conversation to talk a little bit about the Haney test. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and maybe a little bit about how it differs from other common soil tests?
Yeah, so it is a pretty unique test. So it was developed by Rick Haney, Liz Haney, and two other counterparts at A&M in Texas. And it's a biological soil test. It's been out for a few decades. It's unique in that, in terms of, I guess in comparison to standard fertility tests, which are strict chemistry tests. So you look at your nitrogen, you look at your phosphorus, potassium with specific chemical extracts that we've used for many decades now. They've been vetted in the research. They've been related to yield for certain crops. So if you extract it with, say, ammonium acetate, which is normal for, say, potassium, we relate that extract to a certain amount and then to a certain yield goal. So that has been sort of like tried and true, academically for decades. The Haney test, though, it's strictly a biological test with some chemical components. So it uses respiration, which is soil incubated with water for about 24 hours. And as the microbes interact with the water and come back to life in the incubator, they respire, they breathe, like any organism. And then you measure that breath, and that breath is related to, and that amount of breath is related to an amount of activity. So that's one part of it. That's essentially the engine of the soil. So that really shows you how active it is. Then there's water extractable components, water extractable carbon and nitrogen, which are essentially food sources for those microbes. It's the most, I would say, passive or easy way to pull out something from a soil is with water. So whatever's in the soil, the most active parts are going to be pulled out with the water, and that's what the microbes can essentially access, which is why you use water. And then the third part is something that mimics a root exudate. It's called the H3A extract, which uses low molecular weight organic acids. So citric, oxalic, and malic acid, which are the most common, easy to exude root exudates, most prolific ones. So, and that is supposed to mimic a root exudate. So again, something more passive that, what the plant is pulling out. So it just kind of touches on what is the most active thing going on in the soil system in relation to what the plant can see and what the microbes are doing and accessing. From that, the respiration goes into a calculation with the water extractable components. You get a score, which is essentially, how active is the engine, basically, and that gives you a good proximity in terms of how to manage the system going forward. As it relates to certain cover crops you want to use that are carbon-rich cover crops like grasses, or nitrogen-rich ones like legumes, to kind of balance out that carbon and nitrogen that you're seeing in the water extractable components. Because microbes, they need about 5 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, or it might be the other way around, to break down one or the other. So you have to have a balance of carbon and nitrogen to make sure that the engine is humming along just fine. Because if you have more of one or the other, the engine's either going to stall or go way too fast. And so you kind of have to level it out to a nice hum. And so if you add in more things, it's like a wood chipper. It just kind of helps break things down really fast so that the plant can keep taking up nutrients. The microbes are still active. And so, that's primarily why it's a biological test and why it's so different from standard fertility tests.
That's very cool. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to get into what it takes to take a proper soil sample for such a test. BRB. Today's episode is brought to you by Farmhand. If you're listening to this, you probably found 5 rare minutes to breathe, but what got pushed back further down the to-do list to make that happen? If it's your CSA newsletter, you're not alone. Farmhand's new newsletter builder was made for busy farmers. It automates weekly emails, drives add-on sales, and makes it easy to keep your customers in the loop without spending hours behind a screen. It launches this summer, but our listeners can request early access now. Visit farmhand.partners/no-till. That's farmhand.partners/no-till. All right, back to the show. All right, so you gave us a little bit of a rundown of the Haney test in the first segment. Maybe tell us a little bit about proper soil sampling tips and techniques, what to keep in mind for this particular test, or maybe how it differs from other tests.
Yeah, so for sampling, for standard fertility sampling, you can do it one of two ways. I guess you can do it many ways, but the standard approach is either post-harvest, so post-fall, to see what's depleted or like what's left in the soil, or pre-planting in the spring. And so you can see what you need to add. Some people add, I guess the larger co-ops or entities like that, they'll add the fertilizers post-harvest. If you have a dry winter, you can kind of get away with that. You don't lose too much of it, but it's typically recommended to apply anything pre-planting to make sure that nothing's lost. Now, this is different in sampling for soil health, from any other soil health test. Haney, PLFA, a lot of carbon testing, is that you do it in the spring whenever the ground has warmed up to about 50 degrees for several weeks. So it's not frozen, the sun's been out, and it does get cold at night still, but you kind of want to see as things are waking up what they're going to be doing. And so normally you sample in the spring pre-planting. I would say several weeks pre-planting, and it really depends on the crop as well. But you can do standard grid sampling or composite sampling as you do with normal fertility tests. So basically, you can take a sample every 2.5 acres or 5 acre grid, depending on the size that you're using. A lot of large growers, I rarely see them using strictly soil health tests for a lot of their fertility because a lot of their stuff is yield based. Now, if they're like organic or regenerative systems, yes, they will do that. I've seen people who do large amounts of grid sampling and using like Haney test or other soil health tests. But you can approach it that way as well. If you're working with a smaller area, you can do a composite if it's a flatter area, which means like you would take about 15 to 20 cores within a given region, you mix it up, and then you take a subsample of that, and that represents a certain area. Now, we say the composite shouldn't represent more than a 40-acre plot. So it really depends on kind of what you're working with, what the area you're working with, the crop, and the topography. If it's more hilly, you match up zones. So the high points to high points, the slopes to the slopes, and then the low-lying areas to low-lying areas. And then you can composite those similar areas together to represent those specific areas. That's the other way to do it if you're like zone sampling in hillier areas.
That's very interesting. I actually am on a bit of a slope, and I've kind of broken it up more by plot, but I hadn't thought about doing it. Like some of the plots, they start at the top, obviously, and then end at the bottom. I hadn't thought about doing it, sampling the center of those plots as one sample and then the tops and the bottoms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because the chemistry of the low-lying areas, the slopes, and the top areas, they're very different. I mean, when I was an undergrad, we did a research study actually near Tahoe looking at the chemistry of a slope, or what they call a katina. And the texture and the chemistry of the low-lying areas, because the clay is washing off and going down there, has a very different chemistry and fertility regime than the slope, which is less developed. Things are kind of like running off the slope, so it might require more fertility. And then on the upper areas where it gets a lot of the rain and moisture, and sometimes the heat, it has a very different fertility regime as well. So in these areas where they do, like eastern Washington, where they have the Palouse, the rolling hills of the Palouse, a lot of that is very like precisionally managed because of the drastic chemistry differences across the entire topography.
And you mentioned earlier kind of organic farmers and regenerative farmers versus sort of larger scale conventional farmers in their interest in this test. Does that track? Like, do you see more interest within the sort of organic regenerative community with this test, or is it growing interest in the conventional community? Like, what do you see there?
Yeah, I think, especially since now we have some of these certifications. So Rodale has their ROC, their regenerative organic certification. And actually, I was at the co-op last week, and I was looking through some of the products, and I saw the label on there for some of these. So usually it's the larger regenerative organic groups that are actually using this test and other soil health tests as a way to kind of track their progress, and and now also as per the requirement for some of these certifications. But a lot of them, yes, they are using Haney tests or other soil health tests because they are different in terms of how they're managing their soil. Because again, it's more of like a biological approach to management. So you need a biological indicator of some kind, whether it's the water extractable components or the respiration. The respiration is a really good one. That really is going to tell you how active that soil is. And that's kind of the key hallmark of the Haney test, is that everything really centers, especially the calculation, on that respiration. That really governs the outcome of the value that you're going to be getting. So, if you have low respiration, you're going to have a low score, and essentially it indicates low native fertility. So you have to put in amendments, cover crops, organics of some kind. That kind of helps rev up the engine again, and do that for at least 2 growing seasons to kind of see some steady input. And then also couple it with practices such as no-till, minimal till, things like that, to make sure the microbes their house isn't being destroyed, while they're doing their job.
Yeah, that's fascinating. All right, we're going to take one last quick break, and when we come back, we will talk about addressing some of those deficiencies and excesses found in the soil test. So be right back. All right, so you talked about taking the test. You talked about what's in the test. Once you have that test and you have maybe some recommendations from Ward Labs, can you talk about suggestions for amendments and amending? How do you recommend farmers go about this, especially in our case, like organic farmers?
Well, the main approach is cover crops. So that's really kind of the goal for things like with regenerative agriculture. It's regenerative because you're regenerating the activity of the soil. And to do that, you need microbiology. And to support microbiology, you need things like, living roots in the soil that will produce root exudates, which feed and communicate with the microbes to kind of help coerce them to do their job, to interact with the roots, so that the plants can actually have nutrients to take up. So it is this very kind of robust, dynamic relationship. And so the recommendation you typically get from a result from a Haney test, or other soil health tests, are cover crop recommendations. And that's one approach. That's typically what people get. Is so if you get a low, if you have low carbon in the water extractable carbon component, that means you need carbon inputs. So your recommendation will be something that's a carbon rich cover crop. So like maybe a grass species of some kind. It'll also be balanced by a lower portion of a legume or a nitrogen rich one, because again, you need that balance to kind of help make sure that the microbes have, a balanced sort of like food supply. Not more than one or the other. Otherwise, you'll have sort of like I said, the engine stalling in some way, and so that's the whole approach for that. So you'll have a cover crop recommendation that's carbon or nitrogen rich. That's kind of the main approach. Is that it's either going to be a grassy or a legume species of some kind. The other part of that is other soil amendments. So like compost, manures, things like that. Other carbon sources. And again, even with just like the cover crops, you need to have a carbon-nitrogen balance with these things as well. Compost is a carbon-rich media made from plant inputs, or you have manure inputs for that. But a lot of that is carbon. There's a portion of it that's nitrogen, which kind of helps facilitate, same as in the soil microbiome, the compost microbiome. Compost microorganisms need a balance of carbon and nitrogen to kind of help break down the carbon. It's always about this balance with carbon and nitrogen. So if you're applying or making a compost, you need a nice balance of a carbon and then nitrogen kind of mixture of some kind. Otherwise, you're going to be oversupplying carbon to the soil and then ending up with the same problem as planting a carbon-rich cover crop, like mostly grasses, that you're not having enough nitrogen in the system. So kind of knowing what your inputs are, carbon and nitrogen-wise, and then also other nutrient-wise, like phosphorus or potassium. That's really kind of the key to this is, what are you deficient in? What are you over, supplied in? Is it carbon? Is it nitrogen? And that's where you approach from there. Are you going to use it, with a cover crop as your, remedial action, or you're going to use manure? Manure works really well too. It depends on the manure. Chicken manure and sheep manure are the only two manures that you can actually meet your nitrogen recommendation for because they're so, what they call hot. Otherwise, things like cattle manure, they're very carbon rich. So you have to keep that in mind. You have to know that composts and manures aren't all the same. you can't assume that they're split down the middle. You have to know what you're starting with, and you can even get them tested to see what they're made of. Most board labs will test compost and fertilizers to tell you what's in it, and that's like the most informed thing you can do. But if you're just going to rely on cover crops, you'll get a recommendation that gives you a good percentage, 60% grasses versus 40% legumes, or 80% legumes versus 20% grasses. That's the kind of recommendation you'll get based on your outcome.
And you mentioned in the last segment talking about adding any sort of amendments you're going to add pre-planting. And then you just talked about cover crops being like one of the main approaches to addressing these maybe soil deficiencies. Is the cover crop considered the crop pre-planting? Does that make sense? So like if you were going to do a cover crop over the fall, do you recommend putting the amendments down in the fall, cover cropping, and then going into another crop in the spring? Or would it be more like cover cropping over the winter, then adding your amendments, and then going with the actual cash crop?
No, actually, the way people normally do it depends on the region and your cropping system. So there's different, so people don't realize how prescriptive cover crops are. You can use them for pretty much any, I would say almost any issue you have agronomically. So for weed control, for compaction, you can add mustards. Mustards will break up a compact layer. So things like that. So there are cover crop species that will grow over winter in many cases. So people will often, so if you do, say, a soil amendment like manure or compost, like post-harvest, it'll sit, it's not going to break down too much over winter, but you can actually plant a winter species of some kind. So it grows over winter and will be pretty much dead, I would say, unless it, rebounds in the spring. But you can also plant into that. So that's typically how they use cover crops, is that you're planting it, you let it grow about a week before planting, you terminate it or crimp it, then you plant into that. And that cover crop will then act as a fertilizer source as it's breaking down, which is also why you need that really critical balance of nitrogen and carbon to make sure that the microbes will actually break it down and provide food for your crop. You sometimes have to supplement it with other things, like maybe more manure or more compost or other, sometimes synthetic fertilizers if you're still relying on that. That's normally how you approach it, is that I want to use this as a fertilizer source, so I need to plant a more, substantial amount of nitrogen-rich species, crimp it, then plant into it, and the crop will grow and feed off the cover crop as it's breaking down.
Yeah, I've seen some research about the importance of actually using cover crops and compost together. And one of the things that I'm thinking about in a region like ours, which is very different from where you are in a drier region there in Nevada, but for us, like if we added compost in the wintertime, we get so much rain that we do risk losing a lot of those amendments. So I guess to drill down a little bit more on that question, is the cover crop going to lock that compost in place better and utilize the nutrients better by doing it in the fall? Or would it, in that case, in a rainy situation, be better to apply it in the spring after the cover crop is already terminated?
Yeah, I would say if you're going to be using a cover crop over winter, and if you have a wet winter, you can do it either one of two ways. I'd say if you have a pretty hardy winter cover crop, it should stabilize the soil enough to where there's not a lot of runoff. Because typically what you do whenever you have a cover crop is you're putting a lot of these little pipes in the ground basically with the roots. And so that helps channel water into the ground. So then it's not running off and carrying off things like an amendment of some kind. So that will help stabilize and help with infiltration. Then also the breakdown of that material and kind of pushing it down into the soil profile for further breakdown and consumption by the plant. So I would say you could do it that way. If you have a really wet winter, you could just get away with planting the cover crop and then pre-planting apply the amendment to kind of really ensure that it's going to stay there and break down continually. Now, if you have low native fertility, I would say if you're just starting out, more is probably better. So meaning that you can apply it over winter and then probably apply more pre-planting in conjunction with cover crops. Because normally, and I've seen this with people's reports, if they inherit or acquire land that they don't have a lot of site history on, but it looks like pretty poor soil, it takes a lot of work to kind of get it up to some sort of level that you're having to put less and less into the system, and the system's sort of like self-maintaining with minimal amount of effort. But initially, you have to kind of pump some things into the system. So carbon, nitrogen, manures, cover crops, things like that. And that usually takes about, I would say, 1 to 2 growing seasons to see something really substantial in terms of the change in the system. But If everything's up and running, you could just get away with doing a cover crop over winter and then the amendment pre-planting.
In terms of like, so let's say you get a soil test back and it does have a high respiration rate, like it gets a high score, the more likely recommendation in that case is probably going to be a cover crop rather than a series of amendments. Is that kind of how it sort of works on the spectrum?
Yeah, because basically at that point you're looking at, again, the engine of the system. It's humming along really well. Now you get into an issue if you have really high respiration, because they do need the carbon as a food source, that you could be limiting the carbon in the system. So you have to keep an eye on that. Make sure that you have probably a little bit higher portion of like a grass species versus legumes. So you could do like 60-40 to make sure that that extra carbon's coming in, but there's also the complement of the nitrogen to help them break it down, to help facilitate that breakdown. But yeah, if you have high respiration, you want to keep that engine running pretty well. And cover crops, a little bit more of the grass species will actually do that for you.
That's interesting. It makes me think of, I heard this podcast years and years ago, that a guy was in a southern state, Arkansas or something, and was using straw, I believe, and was doing that on all of his beds. And at first it was like it maintained for a really long time. And then as the soil got better and better, he found that the straw layer didn't last as long. Like it decomposed significantly faster and faster every year. So he had to use more and more straw to keep it, to sort of maintain it. So that's kind of what that makes me think of when you were talking about carbon.
Yeah, and in some cases I've seen sort of the opposite, to where they're oversupplying the grasses. So like in that system that you were just speaking of, it sounds like he kind of really was managing it quite well. And other systems where they oversupply the grasses, they have to go back and add synthetic nitrogen to kind of help the microbes to break down the grass. So in some of those places I've seen it's really wet, and they can have some waterlogged issues, and so that actually impairs some of the breakdown. So those are very specific cases, I would say, but again, they had to go back in and add nitrogen to kind of help facilitate the breakdown of that grass.
Right. Yeah, it's always so contextual. I guess the last question I kind of have is like we've talked about compost and manures and those sorts of things. What about some of those like dry amendments? Are you ever recommending rock amendments or alfalfa meal or those sorts of things, or is it more trying to let the biology do the nutrient release?
Yeah, with the dry amendments, and I actually just had a conversation with someone a few days ago, a gentleman out of Colorado. He was a hemp or cannabis grower, and so that was a very specific system where they use a lot of dry amendments. They use like fish meal, bone meal, blood meal, things like that. For the larger producers, I think the main organic amendments, or I guess I would say dry, would be things like compost and biosolids, sometimes biochar. But for the smaller acreage ones, and I've also seen this with the peach growers in western Colorado, they'll use a lot of the organic amendments, like fish meal and things like that, because they can kind of manage it more on their smaller acreage. The larger ones, may not be as cost effective, but on the specialty smaller acreage producers, yes, I am seeing them using those. And I gave recommendations for blood meal, fish meal, different amounts to use in some of these specific systems. I actually give a lecture every other semester for one of my friends out of California for her class. I do a class on fertilizers and organic amendments and some of the calculations and ways to approach those. So people really like those amendments, and they're more and more prolific now and becoming more affordable, I would say. But yeah, it's very specific, but I always recommend those.
Well, that's great. Dr. Patrick Fries, thank you so much for coming on here. I really appreciate your time. This has just been a fascinating and fun chat.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Thanks for having me. And always reach out with questions. I'm always around.
Awesome. Well, that's great to hear. Thank you so much.
Undivided moves in circles, trapped like a wave.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I will link Ward Labs in the show notes so you can check out their offerings. Also, hopefully I can get Dr. Fries to come back on at some point to talk about the biochar stuff he was kind of referencing there, as I know that is a big area of interest for you all, and it especially sounded fascinating the way he was talking about it. Don't forget, No-Till Growers is now officially a nonprofit 501c3, so donations that, while they're tax deductible and greatly appreciated, please make sure to like and/or subscribe and/or follow wherever you're getting this podcast. That's an easy way to help us out. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. And if you'd ever like to sponsor this show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at notillgrowers.com. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music, Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and the team at No-Till Growers. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Pick up a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of July, and there's only a few days left, like 20 something, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Kyle Richardville, Patrick Weaver, Alex and Oliver, Bill King, and Chris Yates. All right, so as you will remember, our young man with his microscope discovered a microscopic dragon swimming around in the waters from the pond behind his house. Dragons, which exist in cultures all over the world and have for millennia, were not supposed to be real. But by golly, that is exactly what this little boy was looking at. Perhaps, he thought somewhat astutely, it wasn't that dragons didn't exist anymore, it's that the art of raising them had been forgotten. Not that he had any idea how to raise one either, but he decided to try. Now, he had a somewhat clever system of keeping track of this micro dragon that is proprietary now, so sorry, I can't really describe it. But even after just a couple of days, this dragon had doubled in size. So every morning he started to refresh the water in his tiny tank, and every day the dragon doubled in size until at first all he could see was a small little line in the water. And then after a while, he looked, and what looked like a very tiny fish. His mom kept saying all the while, "Oh, that's great," when he would tell her that he was raising a dragon, assuming he was just raising a fish maybe. But soon it would be undeniable. And that is for tomorrow on The Curious Case of the Pond Dragon. Turns out Waterworld, that one didn't work. Anyway, thanks for watching and/or listening. We will see you then.